Welcome to the third episode of the React Code Review, the ongoing series where I review your React code. If you're new to the channel, hi, my name is Yusuf and I'm an IT consultant working in Hamburg, Germany. Today we're going to be taking a look at 6 React projects, a web app, an online shop, a chat app, and a few React native libraries. Today we're going to learn about common pitfalls and good practices in TypeScript and React that you can apply to your own code, so make sure to stick till the end not to miss any. Without further ado, let's get started with the first project. The first project is called Payment Slip and it's a web app that helps you split expenses between friends. You can add friends, then you can start adding expenses. For example, let's say I have paid for dinner and it costed 60 euros. And let's say that Mark paid for drinks 10. And then you can see the expenses history, the outcome of it, which is that Mark needs to give Yusuf the difference. You can also export the expense history and download it as a picture. Now let's jump into the code. This project is built with React, surprise surprise, and it uses MUI for the UI components. The first thing that I noticed is the file names. In React you would normally name your file using either kebab case or camel case. So camel case in this case would be the same as the component name, and this is my personal favorite. And the same thing applies to function names. Here we have snake case, which is something you would typically see in Python, but not really in JavaScript or TypeScript. Now let's move to the code quality. This project is not that big, but I did have a few remarks. For example, here we have this usage of useCallback that doesn't fit any use case, because this function here on remove friend is only called but not really passed to any use effect or component, so it defeats the purpose. useCallback is normally used to memoize a function. Memoization just means that React takes care of returning the same reference of a function, so it reduces re-rendering. This is useful if you have a use effect that depends on a function, so you memoize the function before passing it as a dependency. And also if you have an expensive component, then you pass a memoized function to its props. Before wrapping up, I just wanted to share this really cool code snippet that I found for using context. What it does is basically wrap this React use context hook and check if it's undefined. I really like this pattern because it makes your code cleaner. You don't always have to check if this context is undefined inside your code. And also if you forget this provider, then you will receive an error. So I'm a big fan. Overall, it was a really cool app and really clean code, so I'm definitely gonna use it next time that I need to split my expenses. By the way, if you're a beginner or intermediate developer, then you definitely want to check out the front-end kit. The front-end kit is my free resource collection that includes everything you need to be a productive front-end developer. It also includes a collection of must-read articles and a list of creators who share quality front-end knowledge. Basically, the knowledge I have accumulated in the last 5 years in one document. You can get it for free at yusufb.com/frontendkit. The link will be down in the description. The next project comes from Jose Eduardo. This is an online shop built with React. This is the homepage, and when you scroll you can see the categories. Now when you click on a category, you can see all the items inside that category, for example clothing, accessories, shoes. Now fortunately the pictures are not there yet, but other than that everything seems to work fine. Another cool thing that you can do is add items to your favorite, and from there you can also add them to your cart, and inside the cart you can add or remove the items. Now let's take a look at the code. Reviewing this code has been a lot of fun, not only because it uses TypeScript, which as you know I'm a big fan of, but it also uses some really cool patterns. For example, here we have a combination of Redux and React context. Here the context is used to define the interface, and the functionality is actually implemented by Redux, so it's basically delegated to Redux. You can think of it as some kind of facade and then the implementation. I've never seen this pattern before and I'm definitely gonna use it in my next project. Now moving on to the implementation details, I found this function here, filter removed item, which takes a state that can be either one of these, either cart interface or favorite interface, and filters out this item. This is, in my opinion, one of the cases that you could use generics. So instead of passing the whole state, you can just pass in the items, and you can use an inline filter function. The cool thing about generics is that you can also narrow them. For example, here we can say that T has to have a field ID, which is a string. Now looking at the code, I also found this cart action, which is defined as having a payload which can have an optional ID and an optional item object. And this actually depends on the given type. So if you go to the reducer, when the type is add, we are sure that we have this item. And when it's removed, then we only pass the ID. So in this case, you're using this bank operator. Instead of using that, which is telling TypeScript, listen to me, I know better, you can let TypeScript do the work for you. We can actually narrow this down by saying that the cart action can either be this type, which is remove, decrement, increment, and have the ID, or it can be an add operation and have the item as a payload. One last remark before moving on to the next project. Here we have this pagination provider that uses way too many states. It also uses useLayout effect and useEffect to keep them synchronized, which is honestly really hard to keep track of. So my proposition here would be to get rid of useEffect and just use normal constants inside the component. For example, let's take this useLayout effect and get the code out of it. And of course get rid of the states because we don't need them anymore. And the same thing can be applied to the other use effects. Thanks again for your submission, and I hope my remarks could help you. The third project is an online chat app. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get this to work in my own machine, but this is how it looks like. You can log in with Google, and this is how the chat UI looks like. Moving to the code, this code review is centered about code simplification, either by means of using existing libraries to remove duplicated code or just simplifying the code itself. Here, for example, we have this method group messages, which can be a bit hard to understand. What is happening is that we're grouping these given messages by author ID, and this is something that is not really readable when you take a first look at the code. The same thing can be achieved using Lodash. Lodash has a function, groupBy, that receives an array and a field, so it basically does the same thing in fewer lines of code, and it's more readable. Now for making the API calls, you use this custom useFetch hook, which is always coupled with a state holding the data and a useEffect. This can of course also be moved inside this custom hook, and it's also worth mentioning that React Query basically does the same thing, but it has other advantages, like for example caching. So if two components use the same data, it will not be requested twice from the server, and it also deduplicate requests. So if you have two components that request the same data that is not in the cache but it's within an interval, then the request would only be made once. And of course it has many other benefits, like for example global error handling. When you receive a 401 error code from the backend, you can use the global error handling to log out the user. Now I also have other remarks which are a bit opinionated. For example, moving this deconstruction to the function directly and not having to deconstruct inside the function. Now moving on to another component, here we have this loading spinner component that receives a size in the props, and this is used to set a CSS variable which is then accessed inside the CSS to set the border width. Of course this can be simplified by just using here border width and set a percentage. For example, here what we have is at the end of the day 10%. That's it for this project. I hope my remarks were helpful, and thanks again for your submission. The next project is React Native Swipeable Deck. This is a React Native library that lets you create this user interface with cards that are swipeable. Now this library has one export, and that is this swipe deck component. The swipe deck can be configured with props, but it also has a lot of default values, which is something very good for the users. And it's also using a generic type, so that item can be anything you want. If there's something I would change here in the props, first of all is the naming. I would name this swipe deck props, which is the naming convention that I like to go to, basically component name props, and also rename handle end reach to on end reach, just so that you have a consistent naming. Also, to make this library more user-friendly or dev-friendly, it will be really cool to also export the types and not just the components. So basically any type that is used, this enum here, the props and the item type. Speaking of this enum component, I'm actually not the biggest fan of using enums, especially in external libraries, because that means that the users would have to have the same instance of this enum. This creates tight coupling between the library and the user's code. So a better approach here would be to just use string literals. I actually made a video specifically about this topic. You can go check it out if that's something that you're interested in. Now, one big problem that this component has is that it's neither controlled nor uncontrolled. Controlled components mean that they receive a state and set state prop and don't hold any value inside of them. Uncontrolled components, on the other hand, have an initial state prop and also receive an unchanged function callback that is called each time that the state is changed. And here we're having a mixture of both, which means that if this data prop is changed from outside the component, this component would have the old value. Now for this component, it would be easier to just have a fully controlled component, basically not any state inside of it. Now there are some libraries who do support both controlled and uncontrolled components, and the way they do it is by checking inside the component which props were passed and making sure that you only pass value and on value change, or initial value and on value submitted. The next project is called React Native Picker Selector, and it's a library that lets you create this drop-down UI elements in React Native. Looking at the code, first thing that I really liked is the separation between types and the component, which, if you think about it, types is like the interface definition and component again is like the implementation detail. Now inside the types, one thing that I'm not the biggest fan of is the usage of any. I think this is a great use case of using generics, just like we've seen in the other library. Also, since this is just a small library, here inside types we can just have index.ts, which will make imports shorter, but that's of course just a small detail. Now one last remark before moving on to the next project, and that is this children property here. I would have expected this to be the elements that are shown in the list, but taking a look at the implementation inside the component, I have found out that this children is actually the data. Basically, it would be an array of strings or anything like that, and that is passed down to this flat list element. So this should not be a React node, but rather an option array. Thanks for the submission, and let's move to the last project. The last project is React Native Hide on Keyboard, and it's a React library that lets you show or hide the component when the keyboard is open or closed. Now I was surprised to find out that the types inside this project are defined in a d.ts file, which is a TypeScript declaration file. Script declaration files provide a way to define types in TypeScript without having to provide the implementation. This is especially useful if you're using a JavaScript library inside your TypeScript code and you want to give it types, or if you are augmenting the global window object. So in this case, it's actually better to just use a normal TypeScript file. Now there is a hook that is used inside the components that you provide. This is called useKeyboard, and it just returns if the keyboard is open or not. I think this would be really cool if the users could also use this hook. Nowadays it's very common for UI libraries to also provide helper hooks that you can integrate in your code and not just components. Now moving on to the components, you have hide on keyboard and show on keyboard, which basically just call this hook. But here the children are wrapped inside a view and with the style that is provided. And I think in this case it will be just simpler to omit this style and just have children and remove this container here. Basically have keyboard open, if so, children, otherwise no. I think that would be more user-friendly. That's it for the video. I hope you learned a thing or two about React. If you have some code that you would like me to review, then just send it to me. I'm gonna put the link down in the description, and see you in the next one.